Hi, good afternoon, good morning, or good late evening, depending on which part of the world you're in. Thank you for joining us for today's discussion. Today, we're very, very happy to welcome Doug Fuller, who's professor at the Copenhagen Business School and one of the top experts anywhere on the development of high technology sectors in China, both mainland and in Taiwan and on links between those sectors and ways in which firms have developed and the global economy and economies in other countries. So there's been a lot of talk in the media and in the popular discourse and in sort of partisan politics in the United States, in Europe, and elsewhere about the issue of decoupling or sort of disentanglement of various sectors, particularly between the US and China, but also between other countries and China, and to what extent that's desirable or possible. And this talk really began, I think, at a higher pitch around 2017, 2018, but we can see elements of it even earlier. And there's a sort of counterpoint to that sometimes brought up to say, well, we can't really disentangle all of these complicated high technology sectors. So many things are integrated across national borders, and particularly in China, whether that's final assembly or even the development of some of the underlying technology. So today we're going to be discussing just how much things can or cannot be disentangled, and perhaps whether they should or shouldn't be disentangled, and what the implications of that might be. So I'd like to invite Doug to speak for pretty much as long as he likes about all aspects of this, and then I'll come back in, maybe make some counterpoints or clarifications, pose some questions, and then we'll open up for discussion and questions from the audience. If you would like to pose a question, there is a tab at the bottom of your screen labeled Q&A. Feel free to type a question into that at any point, and I can promise you that we will return to all the questions that have been collected at the end. And if something comes up that's really topical to that point being made in our conversation, we'll make an effort to try to bring it in as soon as possible. So with that, I'll turn things over to Doug to speak on the general subject of decoupling and technology sector.
Thanks, Bill, for the introduction. So what I'd like to do is just sort of do a brief overview of how decoupling has, or attempts at decoupling have unfolded since the Trump administration until now in the semiconductor industry, which is really one of the main foci for the US government in trying to control technology to China. So the Trump administration became very concerned about the Chinese telecommunications firm Huawei, basically for two reasons. On the one hand, there were concerns that Huawei, through selling telecom infrastructure equipment all over the world, would serve as a panopticon for China, the Chinese government, to spy on various nations. There's at least some evidence for this, particularly an unfortunate situation in Australia where new software patches were uploaded that seemed to have spyware in them from China. And then the other issue was just the concern that, coupled to the first concern, but also it's sort of in parallel, that Huawei was going to eat everyone's lunch in the newest generation of telecom technology, 5G, where in fact the US did not even have a major vendor involved. But the sheer fact that this Chinese company would dominate might lead to a technological trajectory where there would be continued domination. So the US government decided, well, we're going to prevent Huawei from having access to American chips through this entity list managed by the Department of Commerce. What they didn't really realize is the entity list was created quite a long time ago. before sort of the fragmentation of value chains. So many ways we organize production today weren't really anticipated. For instance, if these chips were designed in the US but manufactured overseas, they generally were exempt from these controls. So over a process of about a year, from May 2019 to May 2020, the US government got further input and redesigned the rules to create a new rule basically for Huawei concerning the so-called foreign direct product rule, in which they said that even sort of indirect inputs from American companies could not be used to service Huawei. And principally what they were trying to do was weaponize the supply chain in semiconductors, because they knew that there are two key inputs into the design and manufacturing semiconductors, where the US has a very strong position. So for the design of these chips, where you essentially create a software file, there are these software tools called electric design automation tools, EDA. And basically, that market is completely dominated by three big American firms. One of those firms now is owned by Siemens of Germany, but in fact, in terms of technology origin, that is still controlled technology, so under control of the Department of Commerce, as it were. And on the other hand, the US also contributes a lot of capital equipment used to make chips, the so-called fabrication of chips. And the US tried to use these two leverage points against Huawei, saying that third-party manufacturers of chips such as TSMC in Taiwan and Samsung in Korea would not be allowed to use US equipment to manufacture for Huawei. And in fact, this has proven to be a relatively effective tool against Huawei. It's important to note that basically, even Huawei is allowed to buy some chips. It just can't buy chips in certain areas designated to be 5G related. And so it has been sort of cut off from this global supply chain. There were reports that Huawei was going to build its own fab. In the short term, that seemed to be relatively unrealistic. Where would they get the equipment? If they weren't going to buy US equipment, they would have to buy equipment principally from Japan. And of course, the third important vendor in the equipment area is ASML of the Netherlands. Without their equipment, their lithography equipment, you can't really make advanced chips. So from the get-go, it was somewhat important for the US to have multilateral acquiescence. And they achieved that, but only for the most advanced chips. So ASML agreed not to sell its most advanced equipment called EUV equipment, extreme ultraviolet lithography equipment, to Chinese firms. In fact, it had already delivered equipment to China and then decided, okay, accepted orders from China and then backed out of those orders under pressure from the US. And this EUV as control technology was also incorporated into the Wassenaar Agreement, which is this multilateral technology control agreement among the US and its allies. However, there's always been discussion, both during the Trump administration and ongoing into the Biden administration, that these controls did not go far enough. So Huawei ended up on this entity list. So did many firms, typically much smaller firms that were either clearly suppliers to the military or deemed in violation of human rights for supplying the public security apparatus, principally in Xinjiang. However, obviously, chips have many uses in weapons. There are a lot of different gray channels for by which the Chinese military can acquire chips. So there's been a relatively strong push by, particularly in the National Security Council and within some parts of the military in the US, to have much broader controls on chip technology going to China. Now, for the first about year and a half of the Biden administration, it seemed that these demands for much stronger controls were being fought off by those who were much more interested in encouraging trade between the US and China, and also, frankly, were not welcomed by US allies. The US has had a series of meetings with Japan, with Korea, with Taiwan, and other allies, trying to get other actors on board for broader semiconductor-related controls, but the response has been at best kind of muted. So within the US, the Department of Commerce has generally been a more pro-industry voice, wanting to keep the controls relatively narrow and targeted, up against others who are much more concerned about the national security implications. So several things have happened recently. One is they seem to have expanded the controls for EDA tools. It used to be if you were, one of these so-called bad actors that ended up on the entity list, you could not have access to these software tools. But the new proposal is to prevent any Chinese firms from having access to tools that can design for the very latest generation and future generations of chips using this technology called gate-all-around technology. In fact, there was a meeting in December last year of Wassenaar where we sort of pushed through that there would be this agreement that these controls would be put on the books of the Wassenaar Agreement. However, the other parties involved, the other countries involved, haven't really rewritten their export rules thus far to do that. There's a question of whether or not this will go through. If this does go through, though, it presents a situation where a lot of firms in China who may very well just be designing chips for civilian uses are going to be caught up in these controls. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't bring up the counter argument from the national security side, particularly concerning chips in the areas of artificial intelligence, graphics processors, and the like, that there's a concern that it's just simply too easy for these chips eventually through these gray channels to end up in the hands of the Chinese military. So one way around this would be to have this broader ban. Industry, however, is also pushing back and saying that essentially the current generation of chips and the new gate-all-around technologies, in terms of the software that goes to design them, it's quite hard to differentiate what is gate-all-around design software and what is not, so that these rules are actually quite impractical. And there may very well be a situation where this sort of, as a multilateral effort, dies in Wassenaar. But there's other things going on as well. The US government has supposedly decided to start controlling the export of capital equipment that previously it allowed to various companies in China. So equipment that is 14 nanometers and below in semiconductor terms, the smaller number of nanometers for the lithography equipment, the more advanced the equipment. So before they were really effectively controlling much more advanced equipment, let's say 10 nanometers and below. And now they want a much more blanket ban for logic as opposed to memory chips production. That hasn't been fully confirmed, but it looks like that control is in the pipeline. And that, of course, doesn't just concern American producers because there are competitors in Japan. What are they going to do with this US control measure? They're not going to be directly affected if their equipment doesn't embody US technology. So maybe the American manufacturers can still use that to sort of push back and argue that this control is unnecessary. And of course, it still involves cooperation from ASML, which has sold a lot of equipment already that is capable of going below this 14 nanometer mark. So that's another push. And finally, there now is a much more targeted control that appeared yesterday in SEC filings that essentially the US government doesn't want AMD and NVIDIA, between the two of them, to sell 3 different advanced graphic processing chips that they're afraid will fall into the hands of the military. But that one, I would argue, is while it would lead to losses, including losses of commercial sales for civilian companies in China, it is at least much more targeted and sort of more clearly aimed at what is a concern of these gray channels to the military. Now, behind this recent push, one of the issues has been this so-called leapfrogging by China's best local semiconductor manufacturer, SMIC, in which it was shown by Tech Insights that they managed to produce what looks like a small number of chips for a Bitcoin mining firm. So these are sort of Bitcoin mining processing chips. The firm was called Minerva, and these were manufactured at 7 nanometers, where under the controls facing SMIC, because it got in trouble when it was clearly doing some research with military research institutes. It was supposed to not be making 10 nanometer or below. So many people have interpreted this as showing how China has managed to overcome these sanctions to either create some workaround with the sanctions or just on its own have some indigenous breakthrough. There's been a lot of media coverage that is bought into that argument. That may very well have fed into the push now to have much broader controls. This assessment of what happened, I think, is incorrect. Talking to people in the industry in China, including people supplying equipment to SMIC, who have some insight into their operations, it looks like they had to use older lithography equipment to do what they call multiple exposures, which typically leads to very low yields in order to pull this off. And that means this isn't really commercially viable. Furthermore, if you're talking about, small batch production that doesn't have any scale economies in advanced chips, well, China actually already has that technology. It's e-beam technology. If you want to make a very small batch, they can already do that. On top of all that, before this even became news, both TSMC and Intel in their public reports have basically said for the mainstream process technology at, let's say, 16 nanometers and 14 nanometers, the so-called FinFET technology, if you want to drive that down to 10 or even 7 nanometers, putting aside the issue of the lithography, you can probably reuse 90 to 95% of their equipment. So the equipment that SMIC already had on hand could be used for doing most of that process. They just didn't have the advanced EUV lithography equipment. And of course, that led to what are probably terrible yields. So where are we today? We're essentially after a period of sort of stasis where it seemed that the US was pursuing relatively targeted controls and not being able to implement much broader controls between pushback from industry and allies. Now we seem to be turning to some broader controls. I would argue, as much as it is true that there is this issue of it being very hard to control these gray channels that feed into the military in China, that having very broad controls is also quite dangerous because it makes it harder and harder to keep not only our formal allies in places like Japan and Taiwan and the Netherlands, well, I guess Taiwan's more informal, but also sort of the hidden commercial allies of the US within China on team. So in China, a lot of these firms, they are perfectly happy using American EDA tools and sending their chips to be made in plants chock-a-block with American equipment run by Samsung or TSMC in Korea or Taiwan, and maybe in the future in the US as well. But if they're closed off from access to the best technology abroad, then suddenly there'll be more and more interest in creating alternative. And this is also true for some of our allies. There was some grumbling from ASML in the Netherlands of losing some orders in China because of these controls. But the fact of the matter, they were in rude financial health. They had this huge waiting list for their equipment. Losing a few orders in China didn't really mean much. But now it looks like the industry in general is starting to head into a downturn. The equipment makers are suddenly going to start also feeling the pinch, and suddenly you can expect these allies to become more aggravated, start contemplating, well, maybe there should be some ways to figure out how to work together to de-Americanize these fabrication facilities, these fabs that produce the chips, so we're no longer under US controls. In fact, even US equipment manufacturers in the past have mistakenly, in public meetings with investors, sort of broached this idea as well. So going forward, the US is in a bit of a tricky situation in trying to balance the health and development of its own industry vis-a-vis these security concerns. On the one hand, if it's something like these, 3 chips from AMD and NVIDIA, it looks relatively narrow and understandable. These much more broader bans that say, oh, you can't produce any advanced chips in your own fabs, or you can't design advanced chips, seem to be more problematic if they in fact are able to be implemented.
Great. That's extremely informative. So it seems like, just to recap a little bit, I mean, with the end of consensus in the United States regarding what we could call an engagement policy towards China, and the rise of new concerns about sort of too much dependence or too much trade with China in certain areas, leading to national security risks, and an attempt to sort of disentangle some of the high-tech sectors, the US is placing controls primarily on these 2 aspects of chip technology, right, that they kind of dominate. One, the EDA design software, and the second being some of the lithography equipment for manufacture of chips, even though most of that actual manufacturing doesn't take place in the United States, right? And obviously the design could take place anywhere as well.
That's right. I mean, it's not just lithography, it's all the capital equipment that goes into fabrication. So
right. And the US is really dominant in all of those things. It seems like no one else is making the software at all, right? That could be done.
Yeah, on the EDA side, the US is very dominant. On the capital equipment side, it's more complicated
because they're Dutch and Japanese companies.
Yeah, the Dutch, there's basically only one advanced lithography equipment maker, and that's ASML.
Right.
So you have to have them on board, have the Dutch government on board. And then the Japanese, generally how it breaks down, there's many different types of equipment that go into these advanced fabs. And in some of those pieces of equipment, various Japanese companies like Tokyo Electron are the dominant firm. In other pieces, the US firms are. But what I always hear from industry is, this comes and goes. Just because one firm is the lead in that piece of equipment for a while doesn't mean it's always going to stay that way. So for every piece of equipment that the American firms make, there's at least a latent competitor in Japan that could potentially catch up.
Right. And then if we think about sort of what the effects of this are on China, right? So it sounds like the controls, at least in the very short term, do present a major hurdle, not just for Huawei, but for SMIC, for all of the various Chinese companies that might want to use these technologies to produce advanced chips, right? It's much harder for them to do it. They have to look elsewhere. The elsewhere that they can look tends to be Japan or the Netherlands. There are issues with importing that equipment as well for the Chinese companies. So it seems like they are taking a hit in the short term. We had a question from the audience while you were talking about, might this just in fact spur China's efforts to become self-sufficient in this? Could China actually not just leapfrog in producing the 7-nanometer chip, but actually develop EDA software of its own or lithography equipment that's as good or better than the equipment from ASML or other American technology?
Right. I would argue that so of those two, like developing the equipment for the fab versus the software tools, probably the software is an easier hurdle to overcome, though it would still be difficult. But I would like to emphasize this is quite a global industry. There's no one country that can really decide to go alone on this. And China's disadvantage is, all the major countries involved in this are allies or friends of the United States. And China's reputation has really taken a hit over the years under Xi. It used to have many more friends in Europe, rightly or wrongly. That's also in decline, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So the question is, all right, if we can't develop it on our own, who can we work with? And as long as the controls are relatively narrow, then US allies don't really want to work with China. Like, why should we bother for this, what will ultimately be a relatively small market, when there's the wider market out there in the global economy.
Right, because that's another issue, is how big is the Chinese market for this? It sounds like, one assumes always that China's got this phenomenally big market for everything and just voracious appetite for any kind of things that can be sold. But it seems with these chips, not really.
Well, I mean, China is a substantial player in this marketplace. It does consume a lot. It's a little bit difficult sometimes to just take the headline figures of imports or total consumption, because China is still this huge export platform. So a lot of the chips are then re-exported in assembled goods. But it is a major market. So if you were going to close off the entire Chinese marketplace, then that becomes an issue for these capital equipment firms and the like. However, if it's just targeted firms, it may not matter as much. For instance, Huawei looked like it was this huge consumer of advanced chips before the controls came down. But in actuality, it was sort of front loading its orders. And when those orders disappeared because places like TSMC could not serve Huawei anymore, other firms stepped into the breach to put in big orders, firms like Apple. So it turned out not really to affect the industry very much. Yes, there were other things going on. We had COVID, and then there was a huge binging on consumer electronics and the like. But I think at the individual level of even very large firms like Huawei, it probably doesn't matter. But once you're talking about no more capital equipment for China, that might hurt. Balancing that out, though, is for the last 20 years, it's basically been China, Taiwan, and Korea subsidizing their fabrication capacity, and everyone else just sitting back and losing, if they had market share, like the US and Japan, losing fabrication market share because they weren't really in that game of very large scale subsidies. But now that's changing. The EU, the US, and Japan have all realized you have to spend money to stay in this game. And Taiwan and Korea have also said, these other people are subsidized. So they're even putting more subsidies in. So there's this huge market for equipment that doesn't have to do with China. I would say on top of that, we're probably at the beginning of the moving of the electronics export platforms away from China.
To where?
Well, that's a good question, right? So this is why it's the beginning stages. Vietnam, Philippines, India, maybe Bangladesh. These are the former two, because they actually have a fair amount of electronics assembly already. India, it wants to get in this game. Bangladesh, it has been in the processing of garments for a long time. Potentially, it could also attract investors in this sector. Now, the firms making, assembling these goods have been typically Taiwanese and now some Chinese firms, or vertically integrated firms like Samsung, who moved out of China for a lot of that box manufacturing already.
Where did they move it to? To Vietnam.
Vietnam,
Okay.
yeah. And
now,
for the
go
Chinese
ahead.
and Taiwanese firms, they've really, they're more comfortable operating in the Chinese environment. They sort of have a cultural advantage there. It's a bit of a big ask. Okay, Vietnam a little bit, but even more to move to South Asia, let's say. But as long as that's where the Apples of the world want them to move, then eventually that's going to happen. And with more and more concerns about security, what's going to happen in South China Seas, what's going to happen with Taiwan, you'll see more and more of this. I mean, there looks like they're going to be producing iPhones in China later this year. So I'm sorry, in India later this year. So we can see this trend is going to probably increase. So that's another factor that may influence thinking about the size of the Chinese market. However, even with all of that, it's still a large marketplace. So very broad bans might actually provide China with some opportunities to seek out cooperation with foreign parties.
Right.
Unfortunately, I mean, I think what China's tried to done so far is look much more to indigenous innovation, which you might be able to do that in bits and pieces, but probably won't be very effective for this whole value chain. And even for EDA tools, I mean, arguably one of the big advantage these big three US firms, Cadus, Synopsys, and Mentor Graphics / Siemens Design have is when TSMC or Samsung is going to roll out a new generation of process technology, they want to work closely with the big EDA tool makers to make this design for manufacturing transition as smooth as possible. They don't want to bother with any little guys, let alone some little guy from China where, okay, what are the legal ramifications of working with them?
Right.
So I think there's going to be pretty serious difficulties. And the other thing, I mean, the US might not even get what I guess the more national security hawks want. Like, it looks like these EDA rules may basically fail, may not really be confirmed by Wassenaar, and then probably the US government will give up on them because the US EDA manufacturers will say, producers will say, look, we're sort of shooting ourselves in the foot. Everyone else can provide these tools and we can't, because it's not only China that could potentially become the competitors for these makers, for these software design firms. It could be EDA tool vendors in Taiwan and Japan and Korea. So if it's not multilateral, it will probably fall apart. Similarly, I mean, we don't really know what exactly is happening with the broadband on logic capital equipment, but there's at least some reports out of Korea that the US has already agreed that the Koreans are exempt from this ban. That's even more confusing though, because most of their production in China is memory chip production. So they're really using slightly different equipment that wasn't part of that ban to begin with. So, but it's hard since the full details have not been publicly announced to know what is going on in that space.
Let's speak about Taiwan just a little bit on this, because Taiwan has come up many times, and it's come up in the questions as well in from the audience. And I mean, it's certainly near the front of my mind and thinking about this, and in the front of, I think, a lot of the public discourse around it. Is, Taiwan is one of the key players in the manufacture of these chips, and I think in design of some types of electronics components too, very, very high capacity or cutting edge type components. And so then where does Taiwan sit in this? If in fact manufacture in mainland China or sales to mainland China are important for Taiwanese companies, I mean, couldn't they could move to Southeast Asia perhaps with some of the manufacture, especially under the sort of look south policy of the Taiwan government, that might be even encouraged. Is there somewhere else they can go? Is there some way that this affects them in a more positive or negative way? I mean, is this an opportunity for Taiwan companies? Is it a threat? Is there a particular set of challenges they face when trying to adjust to a set of restrictions coming from the US?
Right. I mean, it depends on how broad and deep the restrictions are. So if they use this foreign direct product rule that they use for Huawei, it wouldn't really matter where the TSMC plants were. They wouldn't be allowed to use American equipment.
Right.
So even if they were in Southeast Asia or elsewhere, I mean, up till now, TSMC is a very Taiwan-centric company in terms of the location of its production. It has had overseas fabs, including in the US, but they've been pretty minor. But now it has this big site it's building in Arizona. They're also building a fab in Japan. But those, really won't help them if these controls are broad and deep. They have a lot of customers from China, so they don't really want to lose those customers. Now, maybe what we saw happen with Huawei would also happen in those instances. So if Alibaba or Baidu can no longer produce chips, they have to get chips from somewhere. Somehow maybe the people they're buying from are still able to hire TSMC to produce their chips. So it's also unclear if it's really deep and the US tries to think up ways to even cut that off, that would be a more severe impact. But I mean, one of the arguments those who want much narrow controls have is that not only do we have these hidden allies within China in terms of these commercial firms who really want to use TSMC and they don't really care that its fabs are in Taiwan or Japan or Singapore, but that also kind of helps keep China in a more dependent relationship in this tech sector, because you have this very good solution now in terms of what you need in technology out there in the world, and you can just use that. But if you're cut off from that, suddenly you are forced to say, okay, maybe we should work hand in hand with the government to come up with an alternative, since we're cut off from the outside world. But even with that scenario of the Chinese firms being forced to become real partners with the Chinese government, it's going to be quite difficult, just because of the technical hurdles. I mean, their only really real hope in the short to medium term is to also have a lot of cooperation from allies of the US who might get turned off by controls if they're too deep. However, it's hard to say. Most of these attempts at multilateral controls may fall apart, and then the US may back away. Before this recent bout of activity, the Biden administration seemed to be sort of muddling through. putting, small firms on the entity list who clearly were connected to the military or to human rights violations, but not going whole hog on much deeper controls, particularly since they couldn't get allies to agree to that. But between the shock of this supposed leapfrogging by SMIC and half-hearted acquiescence for the EDA controls at Wassenaar, this might have convinced them that they can more successfully push multilateral controls. But that's still in doubt.
Right, but it seems like without the multilateral controls, the effect is going to be really limited and short term. That if the U.S. insists on only unilateral action, then it's more likely that China will find a way around it.
Right. I mean, it's and finding a way around it could even involve. I think that the U.S. firms themselves have posited sort of de-Americanizing their own technology. It's a little bit unclear if there is this Huawei style foreign direct product rule, like, how long do you have to be producing that equipment overseas before it's de-Americanized? But potentially could even involve U.S. firms working to create alternatives.
One angle. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say something else. I mean, I think the history of China's industry and its industrial policy is it's been very effective at subsidizing more fabrication capacity going to China. So it went from less than 1% of fabrication capacity at the start of the 21st century to 12, 13% now, as the industry itself has grown a lot. So that's been a success in a way. It's not as much as they want, given the large amount of chips they import. But where they've really failed is a lot of that production, particularly the most advanced production, is by multinational firms.
Right.
Like the local typically state-owned firms that have been their national or regional champions have not done as well, in part probably because they've been too government facing as opposed to sort of international market facing. And the most, I think even before Trump came to office, there were more and more concerns in the US because in 2014, the Chinese government decided, okay, our policies haven't been that successful in terms of building, catching up to the technology frontier. We're going to throw more money at this. And this made the US government even more concerned. Though in retrospect, they kind of, by doubling down on their industrial policy making traditions, in some ways they made things worse. Firms like SMIC that were pretty decent fast follower firms of the firms abroad and were privately owned and managed have been taken over by the state because various state entities suddenly had a lot of money. What are you going to do with this money? You're supposed to invest it in this industry. We can't invest it in abroad because there's investment controls that don't want particularly money tied to the Chinese government involved. So they took over SMIC. In many ways, it seems that it's gone further and further away from focusing on sort of commercial efficiency and doing more things that please the government, like investing in or trying to invest in the latest technologies, even where that might not be the best commercially viable strategy for them. And just also lots of waste in the system. Now there's at least losing track, seven prominent figures who are involved in this policy who are under investigation from the Chinese government. because lo and behold, when you pour all this money in, there's going to be a lot of waste, and now some people have to be held accountable. So arguably, even without the severe controls by the US, or the potential of those severe controls down the line, it's not clear that China would really have been able to develop the competitive industry that, let's say, Taiwan has, or Korea.
Right. So there are limits, in other words, to China's capacity in industrial policy for spurring the sorts of innovation and scaling up that it needs in the areas it needs to really compete in this space.
Right. I mean, I think, for one, they tend to put much more emphasis on building the actual physical capacity, building the investment side, and less on building the soft capacities that are needed. So there are a bunch of empty fabs in China where they really, even though they've done a good job of investing in human capital development in general, I think in this area they sort of made a mistake in sequencing, where too much upfront spending on equipment, where they didn't really have enough human capital. This isn't the solar panel industry, where the technical barriers are much lower. So China spent a lot of money and just took over the international market.
Yeah.
There's still, SMIC's been in operation for 21 years, but even before the Chinese government took over, they were still, not as good as TSMC. Like, the TSMC could charge a premium because would give you higher yields. They were a much more sophisticated foundry operator than SMIC was.
I mean, there's a question. I mean, this is really interesting, actually, to sort of break down different aspects of the industry in China and different entities in China and how they're approaching this problem. There's a question came in from the audience about the CHIPS Act and possible additional export control bills regarding China coming. And that then also flags up in my mind some of what you were saying before about the Commerce Department versus other parts of the US government and the national security apparatus. Given these sorts of splits in the US discourse, is there anything we can say or surmise about kind of where the US is going with this? Right? Are there different players with very different agendas, or are the different US entities increasingly sort of singing from the same book?
No, I mean, there are different actors with different agendas. I mean, it's a little bit, I think, for the industry, particularly under Trump, but even now, they're quietly protesting. Maybe they, depending on what the venue is, it's not that popular to say, don't put any controls on us, let us sell as much as we want. But having said that, I mean, they're quite complicated alliances. There are people, more on the national security side, who are also concerned about being able to preserve the market for US capital equipment, so US capital equipment can stay ahead. So not really wanting to see a complete decoupling. Having said that, with the CHIPS Act and these other investments made in Europe and Japan and elsewhere, it does look like China as a marketplace is just not going to loom as important as it has in the recent past, where they were one of the three economies spending most of the money on capital equipment in this sector. I mean, I think there's been a lot of chatter from Congress going back to the Trump administration, really. Typically, and the Trump often led by Democrats who wanted to make Trump look bad by sort of stealing the trade hawk thunder from him, about putting in broader controls like what I talked about with 14 nanometer FinFET logic, capital equipment. Now, obviously, industry will argue why that's a terrible thing to do, the capital equipment industry. And maybe they'll be able to convince them and maybe not. But I also think, I mean, if you look at the other players involved, so US manufacturers, Intel, they're very focused on building new fabs in the US, in Europe, and elsewhere. They got rid of their one fab in China. TI has had an older fab in China. They're not doing sort of cutting edge logic fabrication anyway. So most American firms, if you're requiring them not to have more capacity in China, don't really care.
Right.
Elsewhere, I think in Korea, Korea kind of wants it both ways. They want to still serve the Chinese marketplace. They have pretty substantial investments in memory chip production there. So whatever the US does, they want to make sure that their investments are kind of are protected there. And TSMC has kind of had this complicated relationship with China. So yeah, they now have significant number of customers from China. But, the founder of TSMC and arguably still a big influence behind the scenes, Morris Chang, Zhang Zhongmo, he has always been sort of bad-mouthing the prospects of Chinese industry, except of course his own investments in China. And I mean, I think at the end of the day, if you're TSMC and you can still get subsidies from the Taiwanese government, the American government, Japanese government, or wherever to build fabs somewhere and stay in your lead position in the industry, you won't be as concerned about the Chinese market, as long as sort of your competitors also have equal access or lack of access to that market.
Right. So in a sense, we could say that the prospects of decoupling are greater than they might appear.
I mean,
in the sense that, China is
yeah.
unlikely to catch up in the very short term or even the medium term with these key technologies that are now restricted. China's sort of industrial policy apparatus and framework is not really geared towards catching up in the critical areas that it needs to. And where it is pulling ahead, it's not able even really to exploit that capacity. The demand for chips is exploding in other parts of the world, as is the capacity of other countries to supply them. So maybe there isn't a need to sweat too much over what restrictions are or aren't needed, and those in favor of sort of greater decoupling and disengagement are going to win the day just with what we have and sort of coasting into it.
Yeah, I mean, those are trends, but China's starting from a pretty high base in terms of overall consumption, and firms are concerned about their sales and their profits. So I suspect, if I had to guess, what will happen is these multilateral bids will, some of them, the broader ones will be watered down, or let's say the US unilaterally puts in, okay, we're not going to sell equipment to China, that's 14 nanometers and below. That eventually, that might be reversed if they're allies don't follow suit. So I still suspect, barring some sort of catastrophe like a war in the Taiwan Strait, that it's, even with this recent push, it's going to be somewhat spotty, sporadic areas of decoupling, but also areas where there's still business going on. And even though, whether it's Tokyo Electron or ASML, they're obviously doing it out of their own interests. This may ultimately be in the US interest to sort of have enough connections with China to, not have them go on this completely independent trajectory, which in the short term won't work, but in the long term, they may come up with some alternatives under a sort of full decoupling of semiconductors scenario.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it is very much an open question to what the US should or can replace engagement with as a strategy for dealing with China, right? If ever expanding trade is no longer seen as in the US interest, what should replace that? Is simply complete decoupling and confrontation the best way to go? Probably not. It doesn't sound like that from what you're saying, doesn't seem like that to me from elsewhere either. But at the same time, it's hard to see what the new strategy really is and how that will take shape. So some of this seems as really a US domestic political question as much as anything else.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, from this industry, rather than from the grand strategy perspective of foreign policy, no one's really willing to defend full-fledged engagement. I mean, first of all, they don't really care. Second of all, it's kind of a bad word these days in Washington, D.C. But ultimately, I mean, I think they are in favor of things like the CHIPS Act, at the same time that they still want to at least have some sales in China. So for them, it's not full blown in terms of, we either engage them in all fronts or we don't. There's this sort of, for them, the sweet spot is, we do more, have more efforts at home to build up our own industry, while maybe at lower levels, but I'll still have some trade with China.
We've got one more question from the audience, then I'll give you a chance to say anything in closing as well. But the last question from the audience says, how do you perceive the likelihood of the recent corruption prosecutions with Big Fund leading to more efficient or better distribution of state funds in semiconductor investment?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm quite pessimistic, actually, because if you look, I mean, I don't think it's just an issue with the Big Fund, though. Actually, Ding Wenwu and Lu Jun and these people have been put under investigation who were involved with it. But for instance, now who took over Tsinghua Uni Group, which was supposed to be one of these national champions and was led by Zhao Weiguo, who himself is now under investigation. Well, it was Wise Road, run by this Li Bing character who seems to be extremely well connected, but also, just like Zhao Weiguo, he also seems to have his own private firm on the side that's also involved in these investments that they haven't. This should be a big no-no, you would think, particularly after what just happened, that they should not allow these figures who are supposed to be running investments that have lots of state involvement, also on the side, mixing those with what are clearly or rumored to be their own private interests. So I don't think that much has been learned. just from that one example. And I think there's a larger issue here is just as long as at the local and regional level, there are incentives in place for the leadership at those levels to encourage more investment and not really stay around long enough to see whether that investment is successful or not. There are going to be these, cycles of massive splurging on investment. The central government sends out this clear signal that as long as you can get someone to sign a piece of paper that says you're a semiconductor fab, you can get access to funds to start investing. As long as that doesn't go away, there are going to be sort of a lot of mismanagement and waste, because we've seen several of cycles of this waste in China since the start of the 21st century. This one's larger just because they decided to spend even more money this time. But I don't want to be too pessimistic, but I'm a bit skeptical that.
Well, I mean, this is an endemic and kind of systemic macro problem in the Chinese economy, right? That
Exactly.
There are huge short-term incentives to increase investment, but then very little attention paid to how to measure or maintain return on that investment, right? That the return on investment is often quite poor in China, and then it doesn't really have the kind of long-term or multiplicative effects that we might hope to see from investment.
Right, exactly. And there's not even, I mean, because of these investment incentives, every region or locale in China wants to build, we want the whole supply chain in our area.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
It's quite an irrational distribution of resources. Despite all the efforts that have gone on in China, if you really look at, let's say, chip design, where is that? It's clustered in Shanghai.
Mm-hmm.
Other places have tried to pick some of that off, but there was just, maybe initially because it involved a lot of returnees who wanted to live in what was then a much more cosmopolitan, nicer city than other places in China, in Shanghai. And it just built up from there. They built all these clusters effects. The labor market is already there. And so that's where it's stuck. But it did not happen just because Shanghai had clearly better industrial policy on chip design than these other places. There are a lot of national design bases scattered around China. Shanghai was just happened to be one of them.
It sounds like basically because it was attractive to returnees more than, say, Lanzhou would have been.
Right.
Or even Jilin or some other city like this, right?
Or frankly, even at that point, because this again happened 20 years ago when they rolled out these national IC design bases, even Shenzhen.
Right.
So, Huawei became this very capable and very large chip design firm, but where were most of its chip designers? They weren't at the home base of Shenzhen. They were also in Shanghai. Just so the pull of that labor pool there. And of course, everyone else, all fresh graduates who wanted to enter that industry, they kind of knew Shanghai was the place to be. So it had this virtuous cycle.
Right. Okay, well, let me give you a chance. That's all the questions from the audience and all the questions really from me. Do you have anything more that you want to say by way of sort of conclusion or summing up?
I guess I would just want to reemphasize that while China has been quite good at subsidizing investment, and in the past, the further past you go, I think the more positive returns there were for that type of industrial policy. But the closer we get to the present or then into the future, the returns have gotten lower and lower, often negative for many of the reasons we've discussed. And I think they're particularly this type of investment-centric, quality ignoring industrial policy is particularly unsuited for these classic high-tech sectors that have very fast-moving product cycles at the same time that they have these complex and fragmented value chains. So to the extent that they're going to work well in other industries where China seems to be emerging, you expect it to be more sort of semi-mature industries that have a lot of vertical integration, like shipbuilding.
Yeah.
It seems that the Chinese method of huge upfront investment may work better in those sectors.
Yeah, or even just, I mean, vertical integration is one interesting aspect of it. Another is where there's potential for extensive rather than intensive growth, right? That sort of massive aggregate investment can be better even if the return is fairly low, if what you're looking to do is just expand rather than deepen, in a sense.
Right. I mean, that in a way could be maybe the story of, that would be the maybe positive story if you think the solar panel industry has been a success in China. But of course, I think there's also a very strong argument that even in that industry, when you take account to all of the money that was spent, that it's basically been at best a wash. Because with the proper accounting of capital, you'll see that has been a net zero effect on growth, and they haven't really seemed to kind of build the barriers to entry that you would want to reap the kind of economic rents you really need as you become an advanced economy.
Right. Okay. So is that pretty much everything you're going to say by summing up?
Yeah. Thanks, Bill.
The last thing I would say by summing up is that really it seems then for all of the debate around decoupling and integrated supply chains in some of the key sectors, one thing I can take away from this that I think is correct is that in fact, some of the decoupling is already going to happen to a much greater extent than many on both sides of the debate might have anticipated, albeit with some limits, and perhaps property with some limits as to just how much decoupling there really should be. So if we focus more on these kind of leading edge sectors like chips, rather than some other areas that sort of take center stage at times when we talk about integrated supply chains in lower value added manufacture, for example, perhaps the way forward is less fraught than it might appear to some, whereas in other sectors it might be more. And would you say that basically makes sense, Doug?
Yeah, no, that sounds sensible to me.
Okay, and so with that, seeing no other questions from the audience, thank you to everyone who has decided to bear with us through the entirety of the conversation. We hope it was useful for you. Thank you, Doug, for joining us this time, and we hope to have you back again very soon. Thanks.
Okay.